Talia stands in the center of the Grand Hyatt ballroom, her red velvet gown a splash of blood against the sea of black tuxedos. Her ears are ringing. Her fiancé has just toasted to his new bride, a chaebol heiress, leaving Talia a public pariah. She reaches for a glass of vintage wine to steady her shaking hands, her heart hollow after months of betrayal. Suddenly, a streak of light blue cuts through the crowd. A young girl, Annie, with copper hair and eyes wide with terror, lunges forward. Clink! Annie's small hand slaps the glass from Talia's grip, the red wine splattering across the marble floor like a fresh crime scene. Talia freezes, but Annie isn't looking at her. The girl is staring at the man sitting at the head of the table, Ryder, no Tajan. He sits surrounded by guards and powerful men, a dragon tattoo peeking above his collar. Annie's voice is a desperate whisper. "Don't drink. They put the sleep in the bottles." Ryder stands, his chair scraping against the floor with the sound of a blade. The gala guests gasp, watching the most dangerous man in Seoul look down at a 7-year-old girl and a disgraced historian. He ignores the Japanese syndicate leaders at his table, his gaze locking onto Talia's tear-stained face. He reaches out, his thumb catching a stray drop of wine on her cheek. "You were about to drink poison," Ryder growls, his voice a low vibration that silences the room. "And I was about to lose the only woman who knows how to find the path I need." Talia's breath hitches. "Who are you?" "The only man who can keep you in this country," he whispers, leaning into her space with a possessive intensity. "And the only man who will make your ex-fiancé beg for mercy. Stay and rule Seoul by my side, Talia, or walk out those doors and let the police he sent find you." What the world doesn't know, Ryder is no Tajan, the apex predator of the Lim Syndicate, currently targeted by a palace coup. Talia doesn't know that Tajan has spent 3 years memorizing her architectural papers, waiting for the perfect moment to pull her from the polite world and into his dark empire. Talia is no longer just a scholar. She is the architect of shadows, and the little girl who just saved their lives is the key to a secret even the Mafia boss hasn't unlocked yet. The black sedan moved like a silent blade through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, carving a path toward the secluded hills of Bukchon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of Tajan's sandalwood cologne and the metallic tang of the scandal already erupting on my phone. Notifications screamed across the screen. Headlines from the Seoul Daily and Global Arts Review flashed images of me pinned against the wall by the city's most dangerous man. Historian Talia Reid, the Dragon's Muse, one read. Another simply stated, political betrayal or mafia affair. My old life was burning. By the time we reached the heavy iron gates of the estate, my career as a respectable academic was ash. "Don't look at the screen," Tajian said, his voice a low, commanding vibration. He didn't ask. He simply took the phone from my trembling hands and slid it into his pocket. He didn't look at me with pity, but with a terrifyingly calm possessiveness. "The world you lived in was a glass house, Talia. My world is stone. It's time you learn the difference." The car pulled into a courtyard of dark basalt and manicured pines. The estate loomed over us, a masterpiece of modern, opulent dread, where traditional Korean eaves met reinforced glass and steel. As the door opened, a line of men in dark suits bowed in unison. They didn't see a victim. They saw something I wasn't ready to be. Tajian led me through a foyer that felt more like a fortress than a home. On the far wall, a massive silver crest of a coiled dragon shimmered under recessed lighting. He stopped, turning to face me, his hand finding the small of my back to pull me into a space. The forced proximity was an electric current, grounding me even as the world outside spun out of control. "They'll say you're a captive. They'll say you're a criminal," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw where the red velvet of my gown met the pale skin of my neck. "But in this house, you are the only person who holds the key to the future. Your fiancé tried to erase you, Talia. I'm going to make sure they can never stop talking about you." He signaled to a silent maid standing nearby. "Take her to the East Suite. Burn the dress she's wearing. She won't be needing the remnants of a failed engagement anymore." As I was led away, I looked back. Taejin stood under the dragon crest, a king preparing for war. I was no longer an expatriate historian with a visa problem. I was the dragon's secret, and for the first time in my life, the danger felt more like home than the safety ever had. The morning sun filtered through the high, reinforced windows of the East Suite, but it offered no warmth, only a cold clarity. I was dressed in silk that felt like armor, the scent of the previous night's scandals still clinging to my skin like a phantom. A silent guard led me deep into the heart of the estate, past walls of basalt and shadows, until we reached a room that didn't appear on any modern map of the property. Taejin was waiting for me. He had traded his tuxedo for a charcoal gray sweater, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the intricate ink of the dragon's tail coiling around his forearm. On the center of a massive glass table lay something that made my historian's heart stop. A series of vellum scrolls, yellowed with age, overlaid with high-resolution digital schematics of modern Seoul. "You aren't here just because I find you captivating, Talia," he said, his voice dropping into that low, possessive register that made my pulse erratic. He didn't look up, his fingers tracing a line that bypassed Pacity's main arteries. "I am at war. My rivals have choked the ports and the highways. To survive, I need a path they don't know exists." I stepped closer, the forced proximity inevitable as I leaned over the table. The heat radiating from him was a distraction I couldn't afford. I looked at the maps, my eyes scanning the layered history of the city I had studied for a decade. My finger hovered over a specific junction beneath the Gyeongbokgung Palace grounds, a dead zone in the modern city's blueprints. "The ghost path," I whispered, the realization sending a chill down my spine. "It's a Joseon-era drainage and escape network. It was sealed during the Japanese occupation and omitted from every modern survey to protect the structural integrity of the royal foundations. And you are the only person who knows exactly where the seal was broken during the 1990s restoration," Taejin said, finally turning to look at me. He stepped into my space, his hand coming up to rest on the table behind me, effectively pinning me against the glass. The intensity in his gaze was suffocating. "I need that path for my shipments. Give it to me, and I will erase your ex-fiancé from the city's history. Refuse me, and you're just another woman lost in the rain." I looked from the ancient ink of the maps to the dark ink on his neck. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was demanding a key to a kingdom. "This isn't just a shipment route," I challenged, my voice steady, despite the hammer of my heart. "This is a strategic vein. If I give you this, I'm helping you bypass the law entirely." Taejin leaned down, his lips ghosting against my temple. "The law tried to deport you, Talia. I'm offering you the power to walk through walls. Tell me, what is the price for the soul of an architect?" I looked into his eyes and saw a reflection of the ruthlessness I had been hiding. "The price is simple," I breathed. "I don't just want him gone. I want to watch you take everything he loves." Taejin's smile was a jagged, beautiful thing. "A fair trade." The following evening, the silence of the estate was punctured by the arrival of a man who looked like a snake in an Italian suit. He was an envoy from the Lee Syndicate, sent to negotiate the very territory Taejin and I had spent the afternoon mapping. We met in the shadowed lounge, where the floor-to-ceiling glass offered a panoramic view of a city that felt like a chessboard. I stood by the window, the ghost path blueprints tucked safely in my mind, while Taejin leaned against the bar, his expression unreadable. The envoy, a man named Min, didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes raked over me with a calculated, oily disdain. "I see you've found a new hobby, Taejin," Min sneered, gesturing toward me with a gold-ringed hand. "A disgraced historian? I heard she was dumped at her own gala like yesterday's trash. Is she here to catalog your antiques, or is she just the latest piece of foreign silk you're trying to break in?" The temperature in the room plummeted. I felt the sting of the insult, the familiar ghost of the gala's humiliation rising in my throat, but it was eclipsed by the sudden, violent shift in the air around Taejin. He didn't shout. He didn't even move fast. He simply set his glass down and was across the room in a blur of motion. Before Min could blink, Taejin's hand was a vice around the man's throat, slamming him back against the basalt pillar. The sound of bone meeting stone echoed in the hollow space. "You breathe her name again," Taejin whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that made my skin crawl with a strange heat, "and I will ensure the ghost path is the last thing you ever see before I bury you beneath it." Min's face turned a bruised purple, his hands clawing at Taejin's iron grip. Taejin leaned in closer, his thumb pressing into the man's windpipe with a precision that was both clinical and cruel. "She isn't a hobby. She is the architect, and in this house, you bow to her or you bleed for me. Choose. He flung Min away like a discarded rag. The envoy scrambled for the door, his bravado shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. As the heavy doors thudded shut, Taejin turned to me. The predatory light hadn't left his eyes. He walked toward me, his breathing heavy, and trapped me against the window. His hands didn't offer a gentle caress. They gripped my waist with a bruising, desperate possessiveness. He pressed his forehead against mine, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my chest. This wasn't the soft, performative love my fiancé had offered for the cameras. This was hard, jagged, and terrifying. It was a love that demanded everything and promised fire. "Does it scare you?" he rasped, his lips inches from mine. "No," I breathed, my hands sliding up to the dragon on his neck, feeling the pulse of his fury beneath my palms. It's the first thing I felt in months that didn't feel like a lie. The estate fell into a heavy, watchful silence after the envoy's departure, but the air inside Taejin's private study remained charged with the ghost of his fury. He had been called away to deal with the fallout of the confrontation, leaving me with the run of his inner sanctum. I paced the length of the room, my fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound books, until I reached the massive mahogany desk that anchored the space. A lower drawer was slightly ajar, a slip of glossy paper peeking through the dark wood. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, pulled at me. I slid the drawer open and found a single, weathered manila folder. There were no syndicate seals or encrypted codes on the cover, just my name, handwritten in a bold, precise script. My breath hitched as I opened it. It wasn't a dossier on my recent scandal or a collection of stolen architectural blueprints. It was a chronicle of a life I thought I had lived in obscurity. At the very top was a candid photograph of me from 3 years ago. I was standing at a podium in the university's lecture hall, my hair slightly messy, my face lit with the passion of a woman explaining the hidden geometry of the Joseon palaces. Underneath the photo were dozens of others, me leaving the library, me laughing at a street market in Myeongdong, and even a ticket stub from a gallery opening I had attended alone. These weren't the clinical photos of a recent investigation. The edges were softened by time, the ink on the dated notes slightly faded. "You were never a chance encounter, Talia." I spun around, the folder clutched to my chest. Taejin stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He looked tired, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying clarity. "You've been following me for years," I whispered, the realization trembling in the air between us. "The gala, the accidental meeting in the lounge, you didn't just save me, you were waiting for the moment he failed you." Taejin walked toward me, the forced proximity feeling less like a cage and more like an inevitable collision. He didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man who had finally claimed a prize he'd hunted for a lifetime. He took the folder from my hands and tossed it onto the desk, his fingers immediately finding the pulse point at my throat. "I watched him waste your brilliance for 3 years, he growled, his voice a low, possessive rasp. "I watched you shrink yourself to fit into his polite, sterile world. I didn't step in because I knew a woman like you wouldn't reach for a man like me until your old world was in ashes." He leaned down, his forehead crashing against mine, his grip tightening just enough to make me gasp. "I didn't just want your knowledge of the city, Talia. I wanted the woman who looked at ruins and saw empires. You weren't a target. You were an obsession." The truth was a cold, intoxicating nectar. He hadn't just rescued me. He had orchestrated a reality where he was the only one left to catch me. And as he pulled me into a kiss that tasted of iron and ancient promises, I realized I didn't want to be saved. I wanted to be his. The entrance to the Grand Shilla Ballroom was a gauntlet of flashing cameras and hushed, scandalized whispers. A week ago, I had crawled out of this same social circle in ruins. Tonight, I returned as a storm. I leaned into Taejin's side, the weight of the black diamonds at my throat feeling like cold, beautiful armor. He wore his tuxedo like a second skin, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back, a silent warning to anyone who dared to breathe my name. "Eyes up, architect," he murmured, his voice a dark silk against my ear. "You aren't here to fit in. You're here to take back what he stole." In the center of the room, my ex-fiancé Minho stood basking in the glow of his new political donors, the chaebol heiress on his arm like a trophy. When his eyes met mine, his glass faltered. The smug satisfaction on his face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't see a broken woman. He saw the woman who held the keys to his extinction. I didn't wait for him to speak. As the music dipped, I stepped into the center of his circle. "Minho," I said, my voice carrying with a melodic, lethal clarity. "I believe you dropped something during your frantic climb to the top. Along with your integrity, you seem to have misplaced these." I pulled a slim, decrypted ledger from my clutch, the intel Taejin had pulled from the very shadows Minho thought were private. It's fascinating what the city's architectural records reveal when you cross-reference them with offshore campaign donations, I continued, loud enough for the surrounding donors to stiffen. Specifically, the renovation funds for the historic district that actually flowed into a private account in the Cayman Islands. It's quite the blueprint for fraud. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly gray. The forced proximity of the crowd now felt like a cage closing in on him. Taejin stepped forward, his shadow falling over Minho like a predator claiming a kill. He didn't say a word. He simply looked down at the man who had tried to erase me, his eyes twin voids of cold flint. "The authorities are already reviewing the digital trail, Minho," I whispered, stepping close enough to see the sweat on his brow. "You wanted a high-status life. I hope you enjoy the status of a disgraced exile." As the security detail Taejin had planted moved in to escort the trembling politician out, the room fell into a terrified silence. I turned back to Taejin, my heart racing not with fear, but with a cold, intoxicating victory. He caught my waist, pulling me flush against him, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a pride that was both tender and terrifying. "Well done," he rasped, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who had finally seen his queen take her throne.
The victory at the gala had provided a fleeting high, but the quiet of the estate afterward felt heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. I found Taejin in the glass-walled pavilion, overlooking the moonlit gardens, his back to me. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and shirt, sitting on the edge of a low stone bench. In the silver light, I finally saw it, the full, unbridled map of his life. The dragon I had glimpsed at his neck was only the beginning. The ink cascaded down his spine and across his broad shoulders in a turbulent sea of black and gray, the dragon's claws gripping his ribs as if trying to hold him together. But it wasn't just the ink that stole my breath. It was the scars that cut through the scales, jagged, pale lines that told a story of survival. "I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice a low vibration in the still air. He didn't turn around, but he didn't reach for his clothes either. I walked toward him, my touch tentative as I traced a deep, horizontal scar that interrupted the dragon's coiled tail near his shoulder blade. "This one," I whispered. "This wasn't from a fight for power." Taejin let out a breath that sounded like a fractured sigh. "That was the night I lost him, my brother, Taeho." He finally turned, his eyes reflected the dark water of the pond outside. He was the one who was supposed to be the architect of this family. I was just the shield. We were ambushed during the transition of power. He died in my arms, and that scar, that was the blade meant for his throat. I caught it with my back. The forced proximity was no longer a game of power. It was a sanctuary of shared pain. I sat beside him, my hand resting over the dragon's heart. I understood now why he had watched me for 3 years. He hadn't just been looking for an expert. He had been looking for a ghost of the brilliance his brother had possessed. "You've been building this empire to honor a dead man," I said softly, looking into the hollow depths of his gaze. "I've been building a cage to keep the grief in," he corrected, his hand coming up to cover mine, pressing my palm harder against his skin. "Until I saw you. You didn't just study history, Talia. You breathed life into it. You made me realize that I didn't want to just preserve the past. I wanted to build a future that wasn't paved in blood." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The scent of sandalwood rain was overwhelming. In the silence of the pavilion, the hard, possessive love of the Mafia boss softened into something more fragile, more absolute. He wasn't a monster, and I wasn't a victim. We were two broken architects trying to redesign a world that had tried to bury us. "Stay," he rasped, his lips ghosting over mine. Not because I demanded, but because the dragon finally found its heart.
The rhythmic drip of the underground tunnels was drowned out by the thunder of automatic gunfire echoing from the entrance above. The Lee Syndicate hadn't just found us, they had brought an army to the gates of the Ghost Path. We were deep beneath the Gyeongbokgung foundations, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder. Taejin shoved me behind a stone pillar as a spray of bullets chipped the ancient masonry where my head had been seconds before. "The secondary exit is blocked," Taejin rasped, checking his magazine with a clinical, terrifying focus. He was bleeding from a graze on his temple, the crimson streak cutting through the dragon's tail on his neck. "Talia, if we stay here, we're cornered." "We aren't staying," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the 3D vellum maps I had memorized. "Follow me. There's a sluice gate built during the 19th century expansion. It's narrow, but it bypasses the main junction where they're bottlenecking us." I grabbed his hand, his grip crushing and desperate, and pulled him into the darkness. We ran through knee-deep water, the only light coming from the flickering tactical torch on Taejin's belt. Behind us, the shouts of the rival soldiers grew muffled, lost in the acoustic labyrinth of the palace underbelly. The forced proximity was no longer a romantic tension, it was a survival necessity. Our bodies moved in a frantic sync, sliding through narrow crevices where the stone pressed against our chests. I felt the heat of his skin and the rapid thrum of his heart against my back as he shielded me from the debris in the distant explosion. "Left here," I commanded, pointing to a nondescript slab of granite. "The seal is weak. Kick the base." Taejin didn't hesitate. With a feral grunt, he drove his boot into the stone. It groaned and gave way, revealing a dry, air-filled shaft that rose toward the surface. We scrambled up just as a grenade detonated in the tunnel we had just vacated, the shockwave vibrating through the very marrow of my bones. We emerged into the cool night air of a private garden, far from the chaos of the main gates. Taejin collapsed against a stone lantern, pulling me into his arms with a force that knocked the wind out of me. He was trembling, not with fear, but with a raw, primal relief. "You saved me," he whispered, burying his face in the crook of my neck, his breath hot and jagged. The architect and the dragon had survived the siege, but as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I knew the war for Seoul was just beginning.
The aftermath of the siege left the air in the estate smelling of ozone and rain, but the atmosphere inside the library was even colder. I was alone, tracing the edge of an ancient parchment, when my burner phone vibrated with a ghost from my past. It was Minho. He wasn't begging for mercy anymore. He was bartering with the devil's currency. "I have the flight manifest and the diplomatic clearance, Talia." His voice crackled, stripped of its former arrogance and replaced by a desperate, slick urgency. "The prosecutors are ready to look the other way regarding your mafia ties if you give them the coordinates of the ghost path. One text. That's all it takes to get your clean life back. You can be on a plane to London tonight, your reputation restored, your visa permanent. Leave the monster before his world collapses on you." I looked at the window, my reflection ghost-like against the Seoul skyline. For a second, the allure of the clean life, the quiet libraries, the lack of blood on the floor, the safety of being a nobody, tugged at the fraying edges of my resolve. "Talia?" Minho pressed, sensing my silence. "He's a predator. He doesn't love you. He owns you. Come back to the light." A shadow moved in the doorway. Taejin stood there, his shoulder leaned against the frame, his dark sweater torn and his knuckles bruised from the fight to keep me breathing. He didn't move to take the phone. He didn't threaten me. He simply watched me with a gaze that was both terrifyingly empty and localizingly intense. He was giving me the one thing a mafia boss never gives, a choice. I looked at the phone, then at the dragon coiling round Taejin's neck. Minho offered me a return to a world where I had to shrink myself to fit. Taejin offered me a throne in a world where I could finally breathe fire. "Minho," I said, my voice dropping into a lethal velvet calm, "you always did underestimate the power of ruins. You're offering me the light, but you forgot. I've spent my whole life studying what's hidden in the dark." I ended the call and dropped the phone into the dregs of my cold tea. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Taejin crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hands finding my waist and pulling me flush against him. The forced proximity was a violent homecoming. "You stayed," he rasped, his forehead dropping against mine, his breath shaking against my lips. "I didn't stay for the protection, Taejin," I whispered, my fingers digging into the ink on his shoulders. "I stayed because the politician wanted a trophy. The monster wanted a queen." He kissed me then, a desperate, territorial claim that tasted of war and absolute loyalty. The choice was made. There was no going back to the light. We were the shadows now. The glass doors of the penthouse slid open with a whisper, revealing a balcony that seemed to float amongst the stars of the Seoul skyline. The city below was no longer a maze of hostile streets or a collection of dusty archives. It was a living, breathing map of our shared conquest. The neon lights of the Game Mom district pulsed like a collective heartbeat, every rhythm dictated by the empire we had rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal.
I stepped out into the cool night air, the silk of my gown catching the wind like a dark flag. The weight of the world had shifted. Beside me, Tae-chin stood with his hands resting on the reinforced glass railing, his silhouette a testament to the hard love that had become my sanctuary. He had discarded his jacket, and the dragon on his neck seemed to glow in the ambient light of the city. "It's quiet tonight," I whispered, stepping into his space. Tae-chin didn't look away from the horizon, but his hand moved instinctively, finding mine and interlacing our fingers with a grip that was both a promise and a claim. "The silence is ours, Talia. The Lee Syndicate is a memory, and your ex-fiancé is a ghost in a prison cell. This city doesn't move unless we allow it." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic pulse of the man who had seen my brilliance when I was hidden in the shadows. We weren't just the boss and the historian anymore. We were the architects of a new era. Beneath us, the ghost path served as the invisible nervous system of our operations, a secret known only to the two of us, the foundation upon which our throne was built. "They used to call me an expatriate," I said, a faint smile touching my lips as I watched a fleet of lit-up sedans move through the streets like cells in a bloodstream. "They used to say I didn't belong." Tae-jin turned then, his eyes burning with that familiar, possessive fire. He caught my chin, tilting my face up until there was no world left but him. "You are the matriarch of the No Syndicate. You are the heartbeat of Seoul. You don't just belong here, Talia. You own the very ground they walk on." He pulled me flush against him, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that tasted of victory and a future paved in obsidian. The forced proximity that had once been my cage was now my kingdom. As the moon climbed higher over the Seoul Tower, I realized that I hadn't just survived the scandal, I had redesigned my destiny. Standing at the edge of the sky, the dragon and the architect looked down at their city. Seoul was ours, and we would rule it with a love that was as unrelenting as the stone and as eternal as the stars.